Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to do this, and yes, thank you for everyone who put in the labor to organize this. So I guess I'll start with, the book really starts from the premise that, contrary to what's become a very common sense understanding in American society, that the post 9/11 wars have been completely absent from public consciousness. I was struck, from the time of the first surge in Iraq, but going forward, with how much presence there was and conversation there was in the press, and then increasingly in TV shows. There's the figure, and in movies and in literature, this figure of the traumatized soldier. And sort of I came to thinking about whether, in some ways, the wars have been ubiquitous in American public culture, and I'm really talking sort of the mostly sort of mid-2005 through sort of 2015, 2018. But not through accounts or engagements with what was really happening on the ground, but with accounts, both journalistic accounts, memoirs, and then every TV show and all these movies, through sort of depictions of or accounts of the trauma of American troops. And from that premise, I was started to think about, what does war become? What does war become, and what does an American public conversation about war become when the conversation is primarily focused on the suffering of American troops and what we, in this language of we, owe them? Now, I want to start by saying this isn't an argument against people being traumatized. I think there's obviously very real trauma. It's also not an argument against how institutionally, whether within the military, the VA, or broader, soldiers' trauma and veterans' trauma should be dealt with. And a big arc of the book deals with that transformation, the ways in which PTSD gets integrated into the cost of making war, right? And honestly, in that section of the book, I also talk about the ways in which I think that the treatment paradigms actually are completely inadequate to the task at hand. But the larger question of the book is about politics and ethics of citizenship, and what happens to the possibility of a political conversation when not just the trauma of the soldier, but the trauma of the soldier is tied to this notion that the only person that can know war is the soldier who's been to war, right? And then I talk about both how that assumption can only be made in a society that fights its wars thousands of miles away, because most victims of war we know since the Second World War have been civilians, and that was certainly civilians in other countries, and that's certainly been the case in the post 9/11 wars. But also, I then think about the consequences. What kind of political critique gets shut down in the name of both support the troops, although it's often more rhetorical than real, and on the other hand, you cannot know war if you were not there. And that's sort of what gets traced through the book, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. There are many intersections in our books. Mine is an investigation of immigrants, non-citizen immigrants who enlist in the U.S. military. And well, the very first assumption that I had to grapple with when doing the research is the fact that a lot of people don't know that it's possible to enlist as a non-citizen, and I came up against that a lot in just trying to recruit participants. But once you get past that, and when people know that immigrants are able to enlist, there are several assumptions that I made. One is that immigrants are enlisting for the faster route to citizenship. So, the reason that people are joining the military is to get U.S. citizenship, which the real story is a lot more complicated than that. And I came to this work actually from a different project that was really focused on the immigration system, and learning that about deported veterans. And there's a chapter in my book about deported veterans. So these are veterans who never got U.S. citizenship, and like all other immigrants who don't have U.S. citizenship are vulnerable to deportation. So they came into contact with the criminal justice system for a variety of reasons, and were then deported. So the questions, the intersections of the immigration system and the military is what drove me to write this book. And what I found from interviewing more than 70 non-citizens who had enlisted is that, these are really mammoth systems that they're, I think of people being stuck in the gears between them. And I also came to really realize and grapple with in my book that military is seen as a way for immigrants to pay back their debt that they're supposedly have to the United States for being allowed in, and that immigrants who serve or who work in the military, who enlist, are the best kind of immigrant, the model immigrant. And in the book, I really try to portray the experience of all the complex reasons for enlistment, where citizenship often does not play much of a role at all, to the experience of being a military worker and being a foot soldier of empire, and what that was like for immigrants, to try to puncture some of these myths about deservingness that are so attached themselves to the figure of the immigrant in the U.S.
So maybe I'll follow up on that, because I think you make a really, I think it's worth fleshing out for people the complex reasons that people who are immigrants join the military. And you detail that at an individual level, but you also talk about both transnational masculinities and transnational militarism that puts those decisions in a wider global context. And I thought it'd be great if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. Right, so the reasons that immigrants join the military, as I mentioned, a lot of people assume that I would be getting citizenship faster. And there were a few people for whom that was a very important part of their decision, but they were a particular type of immigrant. They're usually folks who immigrated in young adulthood, had not grown up in the United States, and they had some kind of urgent situation with the family member that they needed to have this faster route to citizenship. I also, of course, write about how that is often a false promise, that there is a promise of a fast route to citizenship that was only realized in a kind of a very limited time span from about 2007 to 2017, and since then it's not really faster, and before that it was not really faster. But citizenship aside, immigrants who grow up in the United States, there's a huge overlap in why they enlist with why anyone would enlist. So some see it as a stable job with benefits, others see it as a way to pay for college. This is happening in a context where especially young people of color are growing up and going to schools that are flooded with military recruitment activities, JROTC, marketing in their communities, and it's just seen as a viable career option. There is definitely also, here I get to the transnational angle. In general, people who grow up in military families are more likely to enlist, and people who live close to military bases. But how would that work for immigrants, right? Their parents, if they're not U.S. citizens, their parents are unlikely to have served in the U.S. military. But what I found is that this militarism in this intergenerational kind of military orientation in the family spans borders. I talked to people whose parents or family members were in militaries elsewhere. Sometimes that was really fascinating, in militaries that were fighting the U.S., but it's that orientation of militarism with a very heavy dose of warrior masculinities that took different shapes in different national contexts that sometimes drove these young people to enlist, to be a real man. Some people had a real interest in guns and weaponry. That was also, sometimes was related to their family context from where they have come from, whether having family members who serve in the military, themselves having, aspirations to serve in other militaries, or having parents or other family members who worked as contractors for the U.S. military. we have to remember U.S. military presence is so heavy across the globe. So all these people across the globe come into contact with military installations, bases, technologies, and so the roots of enlistment can sometimes be there as well.
That makes sense. One of the kind of framing challenges of the book is your kind of critical engagement with an assumption about the military being, whether domestically, right, the most racially integrated institution, and therefore a kind of good route towards integration and then towards assimilation of immigrants. And I think you challenge that both substantively and politically, like whether that's the political ethic you want to go for, but also substantively the complexity of what happens within the military among immigrants, and maybe it's worth laying that out a bit.
Yeah, and I'm going to punt that one to you too, because you do some heavy lifting in that department in your book. Yes, I think the premise of my book that I hope comes through is that when we talk about military labor as a way for immigrants to integrate into U.S. society or assimilate, whatever terms you want to use, that really helps to hide and entrench kind of like the current U.S. cultural pattern of not critically examining what military labor consists of and what the U.S. military does across the globe. I mean, aside from that, I also talk about what I call the injuries of assimilation through the military, both, on the body of the military worker who's an immigrant, but also what it's like to be in gendered and racialized bodies as a military worker who is perceived to be a foreigner, and suspect this especially, really affected people who are racialized as Muslim, whether or not they are, and the women that I spoke to, and what their experiences were like, which really belied the rubric of assimilation or integration through military work. But Nadia, I wonder if you can also take up the subject of what is hidden when we focus, in your case, on the trauma and damage to the American soldier.
So I might give a kind of long answer to that. To begin with, I think, so what the book does is it goes back to the Vietnam era and traces the origin of a discourse about, I mean, it's not the first time we've talked about soldier trauma, but PTSD as a diagnostic category enters the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in 1980. And it's really a consequence of, or an outcome of activism among anti-war veterans, Vietnam veterans, and the psychiatrists who worked with them. And at that point, the question of the trauma of the sort of immense trauma that was being suffered and spoken about by vets who'd returned from the war in Vietnam was tethered to a political critique of the war, right? So we often think about PTSD and trauma as a condition of victimhood, right? Starting in the 80s and 90s, the iconic figure is often, the victim of rape, of incest, et cetera. But in that moment, the understanding of combat trauma was people were traumatized by what they'd done, by what they'd seen, by what Robert J. Lifton referred to as the atrocity producing situation on the killing fields of Vietnam. So it was very tethered to a critique of the war. And at that moment, then you get this sort of, with the rise of conservative politics in the Reagan administration in the late 70s and 80s, there's an attempt to reconstruct that. And it's not just reconstructing the trauma, but reconstructing the soldier in the war itself, that it wasn't a bad war. It wasn't the war was lost on U.S. soil by opposition to the war, not on the killing fields of Vietnam. And part of that reconstruction is what's become so ubiquitous, which is this sort of sense of you have to support the troops, if not the war. And again, it's rooted in a whole mythology about how Vietnam veterans were treated when they returned, which overlooks their own political involvement, there was a significant number of troops and active duty troops and veterans who in fact opposed the war, and veteran groups that led the opposition. But anyway, so the way I get from there to the present is then to think about that question of you have to support the troops no matter what you think of the war. And again, I'm not talking here about institutional support, we can talk about that later, but as sort of a demand of citizenship, gets really tethered in a certain public discourse in the during the height of the war on terror to soldier trauma, right? And there's a complexity of, so what is this trauma? On the one hand, there's a reopening within psychiatry of a conversation of what is combat trauma, and it's often it's not about being victimized. It's a language now of moral transgression again, but it's very depoliticized. It's sort of in the language of this is what war is. You know, you see evil and partake in evil in a way that, quote unquote, civilians would never know, of course, assuming the American civilian has no experience that civilians don't experience violence, which is a very American assumption and a misunderstanding of this society, but war on their soil they don't experience. And so the consequence of that is to kind of defer, the truth of war becomes the soldier's war story. And there then becomes this very complicated question of what does support mean? Does it mean you can get into a political argument about the war? And really I trace ethnographically and both through a reading of long-form journalist accounts and these ethnographic encounters I had, all these situations in which the call upon so-called civilians was constantly, you have to listen, you have to defer, but you cannot judge the war, right? And I really talk about both how that emerges from within this figure of the traumatized soldier, but more generally, I think, from within this hagiography of the military as, you know, you may not like the war, but the military is this kind of extraordinarily moral institution. The problem is the politicians, not the soldiers. Think about when Trump gets elected, thank God the generals, you know, the adults are in the room, but many of those adults in the room were the generals that carried out disastrous, or not only carried out, but formulated disastrous counterinsurgency policies in Afghanistan and Iraq. So there's a kind of reconstruction that we have from that Reagan period, which is deference to the military as an institution, despite what one thinks of the particular wars, or as if that could be separated. And then it gets more personalized in this question of what the so-called American civilian owes in terms of deference to those who have served, quote unquote.
Right, it also makes me think of there's the profound level of militarization in U.S. society that this is a symptom of. So I write about the way that the immigration system is increasingly militarized in all these ways, from, you know, equipment flowing from Afghanistan to the U.S.-Mexico border, to literally the way that the immigration system becomes embedded in, you know, military labor to, you know, through this faster path to naturalization. And today, during the crisis in recruitment that's experienced by the military, there is a renewed push to recruit specifically from the immigrant community. So there are co-ethnic recruiters who are, infiltrate or join Facebook groups where immigrant community members might be sharing advice about, services or how to survive in the United States. And immigrants are once again seen as this, really important source of labor. And partly what makes them, they are seen as high quality because they have better retention rates, they're less likely to drop out, but part of what is happening there also is that their immigration status makes them more vulnerable. So if you are hoping to get citizenship through your military service, you might be less likely to report, harassment, discrimination, or even an injury. And so as to, eventually get immigration status that hinges on your service. So that makes you a more exploitable worker, better suited for it. But it's just one of the symptoms of militarism, just really being a powerful framework in which we operate, and that makes, any critique or critical discussion of the military is so difficult today. Yet if you think about just even the framing of white supremacists are infiltrating the US military right now, which you see headlines about, there's a presumption that like white supremacy is something that exists outside of the US military that is, somehow infiltrating the military, not that the US military as an institution is, profoundly white supremacist and upholds white supremacy from its founding to today. And it requires, racialized dehumanization of people across the globe as a premise of its operations. And I think that comes out in your book more than mine, that kind of the difficulty that we have even on the left in critically speaking about the military and about its impact on its victims.
Right. No, I think that's right. I think what both the books do is it's almost, well, how does one know militarism when one sees it, right? And the obvious answer, an easy answer, would be being kind of really pro-war. And in some sense, what we're both showing is it appears in these other ways, in progressives who invoke or support the military taking immigrants as a way of showing they're good immigrants. Well, why would that be a progressive political position, right? Or, even like little mundane things, what seems mundane of, I was recently flying again. Why do troops, active duty troops get to board civilian aircraft first? Or the kind of, I have a whole analysis and reading of the kind of gesture and rhetoric of thank you for your service. And again, I'm not saying it's necessarily sincere, so there's the question of how it's received, but it's also why that gesture. And I was once giving a talk at Columbia, and I was talking about this, and this Italian in the audience said, oh my God, in Italy, to say that would read as fascist. And I thought, that's right. Whereas here it's just, it might seem annoying and superficial, but it's taken as the proper ethical stance, right? And really what I'm trying to sort of show in the book is what are the conversations that get shut down. If the focus is constantly and consistently on the US soldier and his suffering, and I do use he on purpose because women are not, it's a very masculine institution, what we're not really willing to engage is, well, let me just give an example. So often there's this new articulation of trauma. It's not really new because it goes back to Vietnam, but I'll leave that out, but called moral injury, which again goes back to this notion of you are being traumatized by something you did, a kind of transgression, or something you couldn't stop. But those stories are told, and I've been in all these contexts of conferences and trainings, and you tell the story, but of, let's say, the family shot at a checkpoint that was coming too fast, you opened fire and then realized it was a family, but it's never told as let's pay attention to the people that were killed. They become a kind of backdrop to the story of let's understand what the veteran, the soldier, is suffering. So there's a kind of erasure there, but not an erasure because it's not present, but because it doesn't matter. It's not of important political concern in the US, right? There's certainly been a conversation that the war in Iraq was a mistake. The war in Iraq, by any international legal standards, was a war crime. You cannot go to war on false pretenses, as we know from Ukraine. There's no, right, so there's been no question of holding people legally to account for that war. There's no conversations about reparations for that war, right? Think about the latest conversations about burn pits, right? Burn pits are killing people. But if they're killing veterans who came back, what's happening to people on the ground that have been living with that pollution for decades, right? And again, it's because it's always this turning inwards. And what I'm saying is that turning inwards is a sign of militarism, even if one says, I don't support the war, but I have to support the, well, why only the American troops, right? What is it about the military and what is understood here as quote unquote service that tethers a whole population to what both of us in different ways understand as militarism, that is just unquestioned across the political spectrum. I mean, not exclusively, there are questions, but in a kind of broad
Yeah, absolutely.
way.
And we're here at CUNY, so I'm just even thinking about the fact that, parts of our institutions are named after Colin Powell, who was the key figure in the orchestrating the Iraq War. Yeah. But what really struck me about your book, Nadia, is that the contrast between the understandings of trauma during the Vietnam War era, and just like a concrete examples you have, for example, Vietnam veterans traveling back to Vietnam to do service projects with the Vietnamese, and kind of active engagement with what happened in Vietnam and to the Vietnamese people, in the way that kind of gets dropped over time is a very striking narrative. And also, I wonder if you want to speak a little bit more about the troops pattern that we're in right now as being explicitly or implicitly reparative to, perhaps the myth of soldiers coming back from Vietnam to be spat upon by anti-war activists.
Right, so, there's this big question about, as various people, I think Karl Merlantes, who's written several books about Vietnam, has said, whether or not anybody was ever spat upon is really unclear, but it's become that figure, right? I think the reason I really went back and thought about that is I think it's interesting in multiple, I think it's a really, I went back and sort of revisited that early moment of trying to get combat trauma reinserted in the DSM, because it had been there and then was taken out, it's a long story, and then defined as PTSD, in part because I think the history isn't well told, because it's often read as that was the beginning of turning American soldiers into victims. Like, in other words, that was the beginning of the US not taking responsibility for its own imperial wars. And I think that's a profound misreading of what happened then. And what I find really interesting about that moment, and it was short-lived, but it was an active group it was Vietnam Veterans Against the War together with these psychiatrists working both in the VA and not, but very radical psychiatrists, was they really provided a way to think about simultaneously recognizing the psychological injury and damage that soldiers suffer and endure by fighting these wars, and at the same time, the political responsibility that one has as Americans, whether a soldier or civilian, to stop those wars, right? That those weren't seen as alternatives. Whereas now, the rhetoric almost seems to be, if you are willing to confront the legitimacy of the war, right? So there's a lot of, don't tell me, was it worth it? But as a political critique, that you're somehow undermining a kind of recognition or support for soldiers and their own suffering. And this comes out in journalistic accounts, comes out in anthropological accounts, where there's this constant, we can't judge, we have to defer. But it seems to me that there was something very rich at that moment that allowed you not to have this either or. And that's, I think, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but that's what I kind of revisit it to say, it's kind of a model we might want to think about again, right? That we don't have to do an either or here, right?
Yeah, I think that's such a contribution that you make this is not a long time ago, and we had this, way of thinking about combat trauma that perhaps allows for more of a sense of, or acknowledgement, recognition of the obligation and the debt that we have to the people damaged by the U.S. military.
Right. And it's not just American soldiers who are damaged, right?
Yeah. Soldiers, yeah.
Although they are also damaged, or some of them, many of them, right? Yeah. Go back to let's talk about labor, military. Yeah. So I'm gonna premise this because I think that Sofya does a very good job thinking about work and labor. But as we were talking, so in my book, I push back against a kind of rhetoric, again, it's comes out in some anthropological accounts, but it comes out in an encounter. So I'll just tell the encounter I told you about. I was at Columbia, and there was a screening of, just a short piece of the PBS documentary, The Vietnam War, by David Burns, right? Something Burns. And then there was a discussion afterwards, and one of the people on the panel was a vet of these wars. There are a lot of veterans in general studies at Columbia. And somehow, I don't know how exactly this kind of transpired, but he started talking about, really kind of cynically about the students not the veteran students, but the younger students at Columbia College who, will ask him, so did you kill anybody or whatever. Then we can have a whole discussion about that too. But his response was, it's such a ridiculous question. I mean, it's just another job. Like, you can be an engineer and you can be this and you can be that. And I sort of pause over, of course not everyone in the military is engaged in combat. But to describe it as just another job seems to me to set aside a set of crucial political and ethical questions, which is, it's not just another job. It's a job that ultimately is about warfare, right? Mm-hmm. And killing. And so, but your use of work and labor is a very different use. And I talk a bit about why you use the term and how it doesn't do the work, the word doesn't have the effect that kind of rhetoric has.
Or I hope that it does.
I don't think it does, actually.
Such a great topic for us to talk about at the labor school. So in my book, I try not to to refer to military labor as service. And so my attempts to frame it as labor was to invite and to some extent force a discussion of what the work entails, because I feel that the term service helps paper over the content of the job. So in thinking about it's, I also disagree with it's just another job framing, but for me in my analysis, thinking about it as labor helped look at not just the work conditions, which I'm always conscious of as a union member, but also like these people are selling their labor, and what is that, the actual content of what they're doing? What are the actions they're asked to perform? What are the goals? What are the flows of resources that are taking place? So in a way, thinking of it as a job, as work, helps kind of open the door to talking about militarism critically, and to be able to do what you show did happen in the Vietnam era, which is for it to be possible to have compassion and empathy for the military worker, or for some military workers, while also not losing sight of the project of the U.S. military and the damage of the empire on the world, on its people, communities, climate, the list goes on.
Well, and I think that's the thing, because I think you do that well, both the service, which I also struggled with but did not get around in my book, and now I'm thinking the term to be used is enlisted as opposed to serve, but a little late. But you're also very clear that labor is tethered to violence and to the violence of empire, and that you never lose sight of that. So it can be labor, but it's not. There's one book that talks about somebody, or quotes somebody saying, you wouldn't ask a carpenter about their work the way you're asking me, but it's not like a carpenter's work. There are reasons people, whether insensitively or not, ask questions, right, about the labor of war, and you never lose that tether, right? It's not like being a carpenter, even if you're doing carpentry in the military, right? It's still not like being a carpenter.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned kind of the war in Ukraine, and I wonder if we want to return and talk about, our books are very new, but even just in a few years, there have been some kind of recent developments that our books speak to. So I wonder if you want to talk about Ukraine a bit.
Well, as I was finishing the book, literally, a couple months after the invasion of Ukraine, So, right, so as I'm turning the book in, Afghanistan falls, right, to the Taliban. So 20 years later, one's back to the Taliban regime. And I felt in that fall, whether there was the 2 weeks where suddenly, and because of sort of what unfolded at the airport in many ways, there was, not just in kind of traditionally, but all over Twitter and Facebook, where there was a kind of sustained attention for this very short period to the suffering of Afghans, right? People desperately trying to leave, the bombing at the airport, and then, of course, the drone strike that hits this family as, again, the wrong family, which, of course, is something that's happened all in all. So there was that moment where, for once, the entire conversation, it struck me, was not just about American troops, although it was also about that. It kind of spun out to, in complicated ways, their moral injury about not having been able to save people. And then, that fall, the House passed a resolution to finally repeal the act. I'm having a moment. What was it called? The War Powers Act, or whatever it was called, that basically, exactly, the authorization of the use of military force that has allowed every president since 9/11 to basically use military force as they would. It got stalled in the Senate. But so for me, and there were some articles in the New York Times, there was a slight opening of a conversation of what were these 20 years of war? What does it mean? I mean, Iraq aside, which again was not a mistake, was a war crime, but even Afghanistan, what was the intention of going in, right? The Taliban had offered to surrender in November 2001. What does it mean to have not taken that up? And I thought there was the beginnings of a crack that maybe we could have this conversation. And then, Russia invaded Ukraine, and it just shut it down. And I think it shut it down because, again, let me be very clear, I do not support the invasion of Ukraine, and I just absolutely, that's not the issue, but it allowed the US, the military, because of the way the Russian military fights, which doesn't even have any pretense to a kind of liberal way of war that flattens cities, as we know from Syria, we didn't have to get to Ukraine. And the Biden administration could reconstruct the US as a kind of the leader of the moral, kind of ethical, democratic West, right? That it allowed us to kind of skirt right through a kind of critical engagement of 20 years of war that are not over. The war on terror is not over. There are special ops troops in Syria, in Iraq. I know from somebody who's worked with them in Afghanistan, all over Africa, right? But it allowed that thing to kind of be slid over because there's a kind of reconstruction of the US now. It's the moral, a self-reconstruction, but also it's a kind of moral leader all over again. And as opposed to, as much as the conservative reconstruction of the US post the war in Vietnam was very successful by the 80s going into Central America, the Cold War, there was actually, for a while, a critical reckoning, and we've just lost that possibility. And it's worth then thinking, so it's kind of reconstituting this militarism now in this kind of unequivocal sense that the US is the leader of this, that the US has no responsibility in what happened in Ukraine, that NATO itself has no role in the rise of a kind of fascist nationalism in Russia. And therefore there's no real critical engagement, and that also there's even no conversation that this war on terror is ongoing because the focus has shifted so dramatically, and it's so easy for the US to constitute itself as on the right side of this war. And the other thing that we talked about briefly is, there are lots of veterans of these post 9/11 wars are going and volunteering in Ukraine. And again, it's kind of written of in the press as if this is like, the kind of moral purity of finally the fight that is the right fight. First of all, I think people go back into war for complex reasons. A lot of people talk about, the kind of mundanity of life and losing purpose. But there's a slippery slide. Now there was a report last week of wounded American soldiers, veterans who are private, like they're not part of the US military, being taken to the military hospital in Landstuhl, Germany to be treated. So where we're going to land here, I think we really need to pay attention, both to the rhetoric around Ukraine and the US kind of moral purity, apparently, but also what exactly is happening here that, they're against people volunteering, but now they're treating them. What is that slide? And where it's going to end, I think, is very unclear. And of course, the amount of arms going into Ukraine.
Yeah, absolutely. When you were talking about the fall of Afghanistan, what I was noticing at the time, and since then this kind of discourse has continued, that the asylum seekers and refugees from Afghanistan are now seen as like fertile ground for military recruitment. And they're positioned in two ways, complementary. One is that they have special skills we need, cultural competencies and language, and two, like they owe us for being rescued. And that is a way for them to show their loyalty to the United States and to repay that debt. So that, it's a pattern that is repeated in so many places, but it's just really underscores the way that the U.S. military often is key to creating streams of immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers that come to the United States, and then how often they are then, in the process of militarization and militarism, are then seen as labor force for the U.S. imperial military, kind of continuing that cycle. I'm also thinking about what is now called the migrant crisis here in New York. And in my neighborhood, there is, one of these hotels converted to a migrant shelter. It's guarded by the National Guard.
Oh, really?
So the militarization just has so many aspects to it, right? It is, totally normalized to have the military providing like migrant security. I'm not sure how to characterize what's happening there. Just the militarism is so pervasive that using the National Guard or different branches of the military for things like disaster relief, COVID vaccines, is seen as a good thing because they're so organized, right? And, they know how to do things right. But it's just the expansion of the military in all of these areas of our lives is very striking. What's happening in Texas? There's a shortage of teachers. If you're a veteran, you can now teach in Texas without being certified, because being a military veteran is a qualification for being in the classroom. I mean, there's so many examples that can kind of go on, and I think about, the really important conversations that have been happening in the recent years about abolition around the prison industrial complex and the police, and how that is not happening with the military, even among folks on the left that you would expect that conversation to happen. And if we're talking about shrinking the footprint and defunding the institutions of military and police and prisons, like that is something that we might think about with the military. Why does the military need to be doing things like that? Like that maybe is a start to getting shrinking it.
Well, and as you say that, I think I do want to just maybe as a final comment, or one of the final comments, it is so if you think about the sort of the rise of defund the police and the way that really took off, and all the kind of various iterations of progressive politics that also got much more steam during Trump's presidency, hopefully his only presidency, but who knows. The U.S. was still at war, and there was not a progressive movement on the ground of any significance calling for withdrawal and an end to the war on terror. And I think that says a lot about the ways in which progressive American politics has become so interior, and not just, around that there really seems to be a loss of understanding that the U.S. is an incredibly powerful empire that is at war throughout the globe. How can one have a so-called progressive movement on the ground that never mentioned, for all practical purposes, that the U.S. was still not just everywhere, but full-scale war in Afghanistan that wasn't part of the movement? And I think that's symptomatic of a kind of and a kind of reticence to seem anti-military. And I think part of that is because the military is understood as a class or a poverty draft or a class, but it's not really a poverty draft. It's a class draft in a complex, collapsing middle class of American society. So,
yeah. So I think that is a great point for us to end our conversation and open it up to our audience for any questions or comments. I think Rose is walking around with a microphone.
You could just raise your hand if you have any questions.
You're getting a microphone.
Okay, thank you. I think coming from one of your remarks about, which seems to indicate the public support or non-support of the military or their awareness and so on. During Vietnam, I think was a very historic alignment between the general public and the troops themselves, a very strong pro-GI movement. And there's a book called Soldiers in Revolt by David Courtwright, which is concerned with the mutinies and revolts of the troops, most of whom were enlisted, not draftees, because they realized they'd been sold a bill of goods and turned on their officers and their non-coms in a very, very strenuous way. There was 700 fraggings. Fragging was the death of a non-com or an officer after being warned that they were misleading the troops. And there was a weapon called a fragmentation grenade, which was laid on their bunk as a warning that if they didn't straighten out, there would be more than a warning, and that happened 700 times. So I think that's kind of historic. And in any long-term development about the U.S. military itself, I think that would be very important. I myself participated after 9/11 in a group which reached out to the military and passed out all kinds of material about this, including a memorandum by a Pentagon colonel named Robert Heinl, H-E-I-N-L, which more than indicated that the war was almost lost because the Army couldn't fight. It was either in rebellion or on drugs. And nothing like that arose after the Iraq invasion that we became aware of. We reached out to hundreds and hundreds of troops. And I've always wondered why there was never a spark. Mind you, there's a great gulf of time, obviously, but what took place during that period of time and why there was no indication whatsoever of anything approaching a rebellious spirit that we could determine.
you know, that comment is so important, but I want to just respond in two parts. One, the question of both dissent within the military and violent dissent and anti-violence, it's a really important story to remember because the rhetoric today, and this has been true since the first Gulf War, of support the troops is framed as the lesson we learned from Vietnam because the veterans were so badly treated. But it's a reading of that moment that assumes that soldiers and veterans were all behind the war and the anti-war activists were not soldiers and veterans. And it's a complete misunderstanding of a moment in history where active duty soldiers were turning against the military in the war. So that it's not some simple moral lesson. It was the project of the Reagan administration to reconstruct the story of Vietnam and of the anti-war movement in that way, to say, you know, the public didn't support the troops and that's what happened. So that story, I think, is incredibly important. The flip side about what you're talking about opposition within the military, I also think that's part of what, you know, I talk about this a bit in one of the chapters of the book. So there's this group called Theater of War. I don't know if anybody's ever seen it. And they stage these, it's based in New York and it has a complicated history, but he basically stages these readings of, you know, Sophocles' plays and Ajax, and in particular, these very intense moments of the suicide of the troop, and it's a kind of staged reading for an audience. I mean, they do it on military bases alone, but the ones I've been in are kind of what they call mixed civilian and military audiences. And I was at one at Columbia University, and of course at Columbia the kids were reading the core, so this was people who'd read the Sophocles plays and faculty who teach the Sophocles plays, so it got a little more complicated about the reading, but at one point, it became this very tense interchange between some people who were being critical of the war and bringing up Vietnam, and some veterans were saying this is not Vietnam, there were reasons for this war, you can't make the comparison, and then the person, Brian Dories, who runs it, really saying to the non-military, non-veteran audience, you can't expect the veterans or the military to be the site of political critique. And this man, who was clearly an adult during the Vietnam War, stood up and said, I don't even understand what that means. That's where the critique came from. Like, it didn't just come from the public that wasn't at war. It came from within the military. And of course we need to expect that, right? And that's part of what I show, is why it's not that, and part of the question is, what gets thrown out is you as civilians, right? It's a use of a term that drives me nuts, I just want to say, because in my world, and probably, I didn't grow up in this country, civilian means people who are on the receiving end of warfare, not people who don't know war, but that's what it means here. You bear responsibility, but we all bear responsibility, right? Soldiers and veterans also bear responsibility, but that's not a demand that can be made, right? And that was very different during the era of the Vietnam War, which is another thing to remember. One does bear political responsibility for what one does, period, right? But that's not a conversation we have.
People during Vietnam would go to the Port Authority where troops were being busted for dicks. Oh, I'm sorry.
Hang on, let's, if you don't mind. Okay, go ahead. And then the gentleman behind you.
During Vietnam, people in support of the troops would gather in the Port Authority and other places and hand out all kinds of material indicating their support for the troops who are on their way to Nam or have been back, or whatever the case was. So there was an absolute bonding going on, and I'm not sure of any other point in history where that took place.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I'm an odd combination. I'm a retired political science professor, but also a Vietnam vet. Excuse me. And one of the things that was particularly striking during my year in Vietnam, because that was the way it was set up then, you had exactly a year. The day you got there, you knew the day you hopefully would come home. And one of the things that was really striking to me during that year was that there was not a single conversation about why we were there. Nobody ever said, boy, I'm here to fight for freedom, or we're really helping the Vietnamese, or I'm going to get those communists. It was, the only conversations were, how do I survive this year? When do I go home? Never a discussion about the politics. And I wonder if that was consistent with what you found.
You did more work interviewing veterans. I mean, I'll say I do know from, I made a conscious choice not to do ethnography amongst troops and veterans because I wanted to tell a war story that wasn't from inside that perspective. But I do know from people I've taught at Columbia who are veterans that it's similar. They land there. I think post 9/11 was more complicated because there was at least initially, the kind of rise of this kind of angry nationalism was so intense you couldn't even ask the question of, is invading Afghanistan really the best response to this? But so my sense is a lot of people arrived thinking, at least from the people I know, that there was a good fight here, whether in Afghanistan or in Iraq, and quickly getting so disillusioned that it became about surviving and making sure that your comrades in arms, although I guess the military in the US wouldn't use comrades, would survive with you. But I think there was more of a, and particularly I think it depends on whether people went in early or late. But people seem to get very quickly disillusioned because the aims weren't clear, the terrain was shifting, and then it becomes survival. I do think that's not untrue, right?
And actually, Bruce, it makes me, I didn't interview a lot of people who were in the military during the Vietnam War. It was mostly post 9/11. But your question or your comment really makes me think about what my conversations with deported veterans, some of whom were Vietnam veterans. And really the dilemma they faced in having to silence the critiques they might have had of what military labor was like for them, what they had been doing, and this is not exclusive to Vietnam vets, because their only claim to deservingness and to a remedy of their situation, being deported and trying to return, was to embrace militarism wholeheartedly and really emphasize their veteran identity above any other identity they had, and to not publicly voice any critiques, because those critiques would undermine the kind of the only viable claim they had to being Americans. Yeah, it's just like a difficult and in some ways tragic situation.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Hi. Oh, is this working? Is it okay if I just talk?
We'll grab the other thing.
Okay. Thank you both so much. I was wondering about building on the comments about abolitionist movements in the U.S. not being focused on the military often. If you would both talk about within your research and experience how things like don't ask, don't tell, inclusion of immigrants in the military and in police, and this sort of like predatory inclusion of marginalized groups helps to bolster this support of the troops or support of police as service. And then a secondary question would be, what sort of conversation do you wish was happening, if you could expand, do you wish was happening between people who are talking about anti-militarism and anti-police? In particularly thinking about, I'm really curious about how rhetoric around PTSD has come into bolstering policing. So that's, I guess, a three-parter. Thank you.
Do you want to do the first part? And I'll do the
Yeah.
second?
Such a good question. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think that the concept of predatory inclusion is right on the nose there. Some of you may have seen a cartoon where there's a U.S. military plane painted in the rainbow colors dropping bombs and on people who are like, oh, good, it's a gay woman fighter pilot. So that's kind of maybe a silly and inappropriate summation of what's happening with predatory inclusion as a process, and that's not unique to the military, is that the way for marginalized groups to be included in U.S. society is through incorporation and service in the U.S. military, and we see that with women, with sexual minorities, we see it with immigrants. Like, it is an ongoing pattern, but what it does, it normalizes the military as a core American institution that is the pathway to inclusion. And in my research, what I found is that you are being included in an extremely hierarchical, undemocratic, violent institution that is maybe emblematic of U.S. society. And so the inclusion is happening, but the rhetoric of including and celebrating the inclusion and fighting for inclusion of different groups into the military, it perpetuates the block that we have against criticizing the U.S. military and what it does.
Yeah, so I'll tell just one anecdote about that, but it's that So, right, when the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy was repealed, ROTC had been thrown off Columbia's campus, I think in the 60s. I have no idea. I think it was a really long time ago. But once Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, there was pressure to bring them back and a lot of support to bring them back. But and this was post 9/11. This was at the height of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. That didn't come up in the conversation. It was, well, now that gays are allowed in the military, somehow it's a more liberal institution. I mean, to me, that was just very striking about priorities. And yes, they're back on campus. And a lot of the rhetoric became about inclusion. It's like it's like, you got to get outside this nationalist myopia. On the police and on the military, I'm sort of glad you asked it. So this is, I'll get to the PTSD thing, but that was one of the things that's striking. Think about, and again, my book, isn't really addressed to conservative hawks because I know they support the war in the middle, right? The rhetoric of support the troops, right? So all the context ethnographic that I was in, like where I was working, I did a lot of stuff with people who work with veterans and, charities and churches and psychiatrists and psychologists. They're all liberals. They were all against the wars, whatever that meant, although they didn't talk about that very much, right? But there was still this sense, support the troops no matter what you think of the war. I can't even imagine people marching in the streets saying, support the police no matter what you think of the police department, right? And I think that, the demography of the police department is not very different than the demographic makeup of the military. And in fact, a lot of ex-military personnel end up in the police. So why that difference, right? There's, again, you can't look outside the sphere of injury of non-Americans. It's just so absent that you can have people, would be horrified by, right, Blue Lives Matter is a horrifying statement. It's not that different, to progressive, it's not that different, it's no different from the support the troops rhetoric. So I think that contrast says a lot, but there is actually a similar, there's definitely, so this concept of moral injury, again, it never became its own diagnosis, although that was the initial proposition that some psychologists at major VA hospitals were proposing around 2008, 2009. But a lot of its assumptions have gotten incorporated into PTSD treatment protocols within the military and the VA. And what it incorporates is that you can be traumatized by having killed, by any kind of transgression. That is going into that logic of the trauma of perpetration, and again, without the political critique that attached to it during the Vietnam era, is absolutely now spreading into the police and the consequences of policing, quote unquote, violent cities. So you do see that move, actually.
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's such a good question, and I thought of another thing that I should mention, and that is, in terms of the inclusion of immigrants, the Department of Defense is a consistent advocate for the DREAM Act, so legislation that would provide a path to citizenship for undocumented youth. They submit, amicus briefs to it on a regular basis, and that is because, that would open up, an incredible new pool of military workers were it to happen. And then, in terms of LGBTQ issues and rights and the military, among the military, a lot of people have noted that there are higher rates of LGBTQ workers or enlistees. And I'm just thinking of how much worse it's going to get, because the war on trans youth right now, and all the ways that so many states are cracking down on just like the right to exist of trans people, that starts to drive desperate youth into the military as well. And so that's another kind of angle, another facet of this predatory inclusion.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant. I've read both books. Both are brilliant, but it's great to read across them. I mean, I think it really is really enlightening. So I love the conversation. I think you both showed how the debates about the military have been so narrow and so circumscribed and only about a very particular U.S. context. And you both really create and open the space to bring in a much larger transnational or global discussion about kind of militarism and U.S. imperialism. And the way I think you both do it is exactly what you kind of were showing earlier, is by dissent within often. I'm wondering what you do, like in thinking about pushing forward the discussions about political accountability and responsibility. What do you do with the requests for people are there requests by people to talk about the suffering of the others? So the suffering of the Afghanis, the suffering of the Iraqis, the suffering of all the people that are, or in this case, the families that immigrants come from, the reason they have left, their families have been often destroyed by U.S. violence. So I'm wondering, that's one way people have tried to talk about accountability, is talking about the suffering of these others. And I think you both specifically steer away from moral conversations like this about suffering. Just keep it to the political. So how would you answer that if people say, well, these others have been left out of your book, the violences that have been perpetrated? Like, let's talk about those violences specifically and keep it in this register of suffering. How do you respond to that? Because I think that's another major intervention that you're both making, is to get away from the register of the moral into the political. And yet that is the register in which people push forward political accountability.
Yeah, what a good question, and a difficult one. But I will attempt by saying that, in thinking about that, so for the audience, if you don't know, this is Professor Miriam Tickton, who has written amazing work on innocence. So one of the ways that your work has helped me think and write this book is about the way that suffering of the other can be a move to innocence. And in writing the book, I did attempt to focus on political accountability as a way of not falling into that trap. Whether or not I succeeded, I don't know. But I did think a lot about the innocence, assumptions of innocence, and how it worked for the different parties involved here. And specifically because my work was on immigrants in the military, the way that often narratives of innocence also attach to immigrants in some ways, although obviously not in others, and how that also really undermines the reality of people's lives, and also denies them agency, and denies them agency in ways that also erases the responsibility and accountability that they have as people with agency, like people in general, that can be erased when the focus is on the suffering, on the not having a choice, on the innocence that comes from the suffering itself.
Yeah, that is a good question. I'm going to try to answer it. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the and again, I also know Miriam's work very well. I think one of the most important shifts when thinking about conversations around the American war in Vietnam and the post 9/11 era is the shift from a political argument for or against the war, but it was a political argument. Is this an imperial war? Is it not an imperial war? Is it right? To what is often framed in moral and ethical terms. And I think that happens in various ways. Again, post 9/11, it becomes an obvious, this is what the nation has to do. There's no political debate. And anybody that tried to raise any political question of, well, what was the origin of 9/11, which didn't mean it was okay, or was it Barbara Boxer was the only person who voted against the AUMF? Where are we heading? Are there alternatives? Those were actually political questions. It was as if there was a moral right to just, it was a natural moral response, that this was horrifying on those terms, right? And that becomes also the conversation around trauma, right, and the traumatized soldier, where it's always about an ethical obligation, where you have to set your politics aside, we can't set politics aside when we're talking about warfare. I mean, war is about politics, right? And that constant call, I think, just makes it impossible to have a sustained, actual conversation about what is the US's role in the world, what is the war on terror, and what is the role in creating, right? I mean, again, I want to say the other side of the innocence is Viet Thanh Nguyen. I don't know if people know him. He wrote the Pulitzer Prize winning book, The Sympathizer. He's a Vietnamese American, but also wrote a book called Nothing Ever Dies, which is a literary book. And he also, so the book is very interesting because it's about rethinking the American memory of Vietnam, but also of the war in Vietnam, but also the Vietnamese memory. And he also says other people are also political subjects, right? We can't reduce other people merely to victims. And that means you have to have a critical engagement. So if you think about even the gesture in a lot of kind of journalistic accounts or whatever is this book is about American soldiers, that's its focus, but of course I also acknowledge the suffering of women and children. I mean, it's very interesting, this category of women and children, right? First of all, can men ever be civilians, some people ask, but it's like you put those people into this position of the innocent subject as if there's no politics on the ground. There's also, if there's an equivalence, an ethical equivalence or moral equivalence, it's not between the American soldier and Iraqi or Afghan or Pakistani women and children. It's between the Iraqi soldier and the guerrilla fighter, the Taliban, or whatever, right? So again, it's another way of just setting aside what is the political argument here and what are the political stakes here and what is a way out, right? And that's the conversation. And having that conversation is, I think one of the reasons it's been extremely hard is, given the 60s and 70s, given the nature of anti-colonial movements, and that the Viet Cong was also a Marxist anti-colonial movement, there was a way in which progressives and liberals, given that era in the US, could identify with that movement. And I think part of the collapse of any political critique of the post-9/11 era is, it's an enemy, quote unquote, that everyone thinks is disgusting. So we got to back away from the politics because nobody can figure out a way in, and part of that is not understanding the complexity of the societies, right? It doesn't fit into that easy anti-colonial narrative that was so available in the 60s, still in the early 70s. And I think that's been really paralyzing in the US and in the West in general, right? I don't think that answered your question, but there you go. What can I say?
Check. Thank you both very much. My question is regarding something that has been mentioned a couple of times, which is addressing military personnel as labor and from the workforce, right? Which is probably an accurate term in actuality, but I'm wondering a few things, right? One of which, because obviously people who are driven into military work are, I would argue, traumatized by their circumstances, poverty, and all of that, and not to take the agency aspect out of it, it's a double-edged sword. It's a double, So what does that mean in actuality for example, the peace movement or work of solidarity? Seeing that your oppressor or someone's oppressor or a lot of people's oppressor, whether, by the end of the day would, for all reasons in the universe, would by the end of the day look at Colin Powell and be like, oh, we lost a nationalist, we lost a figure of the, while to someone else, that's not even, that's a war criminal to some, right? Obviously. So how does that come? Because I remember 2 years ago, for example, in non-profits, I was, anyhow. But to that very, when that comes up as that figure dying, what does that mean? And again, we can bring gazillion of examples, right, of why the school to military pipeline, right? Where do they, again, we can go in a lot of ways about that, but what does that mean on quote unquote international solidarity, work and all of that? So I guess I would like to just touch more on the problematizing it as workforce and what does that mean in actuality on the ground, if that makes sense. And thank you very much, both.
Thank you for that question. There's a lot of parts to it that I'm thinking through. I think I'm returning a little bit to what Nadia was talking about earlier during this event, and writes about in her book, which is how to, have compassion for and empathize with what military workers experience, and holding that at the same time, as a critique of the system and a critique of the military. And that can be hard to do. And also, don't have to give compassion to everyone either. Like that is just, I'm talking about the possibility of having compassion. And in terms of international solidarity, I don't know if this gets at what you were saying, but I'm also thinking about kind of the shift from over the last 50 years or a little bit more from international solidarity and solidarity across the working class in different countries, and with struggles of liberation, decolonial struggles, but also other struggles that were so shaped by class, and the shift to human rights as a framework that really depoliticizes, both on the individual level. So when you're talking about, people's circumstances that push them into the military and, the constrained choices they have, but also of our assessment of, political situations. It politicizes it, right? Because then the focus becomes on, particular definitions of, violations of human rights, kind of almost emptied out of the political context, or about, like the power, struggles or differentials that might exist in a particular place. I'm sure you have more to add to that.
Well, I kind of want to come in with a slightly different, which is, I'm not sure people enter the military because they're traumatized. I mean, some people do. I think, okay, so there's really a kind of very common conversation that the military, in kind of liberal left circles, that the military is both a poverty draft and a racial draft. Now, one of the things you said earlier that I think is really important, one of the contrasts drawn between the post 9/11 wars and the war in Vietnam is that, well, that was a draft, but the vast majority of people enlisted. So it's much more complicated. I mean, there is a difference, but it's not as stark as it seems. The statistics, if you really look at the statistics of the US military, they hew pretty closely to the racial configuration of the US. African American women is the one category that has a slightly higher representation. So the military is still primarily white. Now, if you go up the hierarchy, I mean, you can then talk about rank and the officer class, absolutely. But people go into the military for all sorts of reasons, and never a single reason. Yes, there's paying for college, but there's patriotism, there's masculinity, there's, how people end up at the end and why they go in is much more complicated, and it's never for one reason. And then the other thing that's incredibly important to keep in mind is the most common, something like 75 to 80% of people in the US military have family in the US military. That's actually the determinant, right? So it's like the family business. I mean, so we also have a very distorted understanding. I mean, in sort of common public conversations, and particularly in liberal circles, I think there's a slightly distorted understanding of the military itself, why people go in, who goes in, and in fact, the isolation of the military from the public, I mean, it's 1%, right, is family, and this, like, something like the vast majority in bases are in like 6 states. So you have a massive geographic separation, and then people live on these massive bases, so they're also isolated even from the communities around them. And then you have a kind of increasingly family tradition, right? Both in the officer class and the non-officer class. So I think it's important also not to generalize why people go in, and I think it's more complicated, and I think that also becomes an apologia for not being willing to criticize that choice. The question of work, I think, is complicated. There's we talked about it, a book by Danny Hoffman, who's an anthropologist, that talks about, he's really talking about members of guerrilla movements in the DRC, civil war, etc. And he also talks about it as labor. But he's not therefore saying it's just any kind of labor. It's violent labor, right? So you can think about work and labor as violent labor as opposed to just like any other labor. And I think that's much closer to what you're getting at than just replacing, right?
Yeah.
And it's violent labor inflicted and suffered, right? I mean, clearly.
Yeah, and I think to your point about the poverty draft, I think really important to remember that most American youth do not qualify.
Yes, they don't
to
qualify.
enlist. So the most traumatized, right,
Yep.
by capitalism and all the structures of inequity, they are not eligible to enlist because of the requirements for health, for passing the test, for
having graduated
as
high
much as
school,
they're
for no, yeah.
constantly
exactly.
lowered and expanded.
Yeah.
It's still most people are not able to enlist if they wanted to.
And that actually, I was telling Sofya, there was a report on NPR the other night about the crisis and enlistment, and there aren't enough people, and part of the reason they're turning to immigrants is that most Americans will not qualify. And they're finding more immigrant communities where people, both physically, I mean, health-wise, and in terms of education, and in terms of no criminal records, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, qualify. So yeah, that's right.
I have a question, related to kind of exactly what you two have been talking about. For people who want to learn more about the impact of how U.S. military power is deployed to expand political and economic power, whether by helping people access or visualize data, analysis, stories, not just obviously of soldiers, but as you point out, how communities all over the world are affected, not just in wartime, but how the military is deployed to, as you've addressed, maintain power, protect resources that the U.S. is, getting very cheaply or stealing from around the world that are worsening the climate and, expanding corporate power. If you have, anything in mind, either now or maybe we can share it with folks in the follow-up, but I don't know if such resources exist out there where data and stories, et cetera, are constantly updated to help people really understand kind of what you both have helped illustrate for all of us here.
Well, I think one of the best resources that's easily available is the Brown University's Costs of War project. They update, literally, the monetary costs, the injury costs. They have a database of all the bases and U.S. bases of all the countries and locations in which U.S. Special Operations troops have been operating. It's an incredible resource. And then they also produce these papers that are, they're not necessarily obscure, about sort of that reanalyze both the options that might have been available or the consequences. It's an amazing resource, actually.
Yeah, I would definitely go with that. And I can share some links because where I really find inspiration is in the vibrant movements of opposition to military bases across the world and in places the U.S. has colonized. So the movements against Navy bases in Hawaii or the in Okinawa. There's so many places that really have developed and vibrant movements that have a lot to teach us about the framing of the U.S. military, as well as concrete tactics.